Okay, so I said we were going to talk about book 4 and the praise of marriage, which we did not do. Before we do that, I wanted to look at Milton's doctrine and discipline of divorce. As many of you know, he tried to divorce his wife in, I think, 1642, but was unable to do so. So he wrote four divorce tracts. People often dismiss the divorce tracts as just Milton trying to pursue his personal utilitarian agenda, but that may be true, but it's kind of half true. There really was, I mean, we know that Henry VIII divorced, as it were, his wife to marry Anne Boleyn. And we know that he did that without papal approval, and that was the beginning of the Anglican Church. With that said, there was still no doctrinal justification for divorce, and Milton in 4 tracts does his best to provide that doctrinal justification. So he's talking here, I thought we'd just look at a passage here. It's an argument for divorce. It's definitely, as we said last time, hetero, romantic or normative. It's not only heteronormative, it's gendered as the party who is allowed to, is privileged to divorce, is seen as gendered as masculine, meaning it's he that makes the decision in relationship to the feminine. But nonetheless, his arguments deserve our attention. So I think he's now talking about his relationship with a wife with whom he's not satisfied. Then enters hate. Not that hate that sins, but that which is only natural dissatisfaction, and the turning aside from a mistaken object. Okay, we're resuming now. You see that I'm competing with various things in the house on a Friday morning. So turning aside from a mistaken object, meaning it's just like you bought the wrong dress at Zara. And the turning aside from a mistaken object. If that mistake I have done injury, it fails not to dismiss with recompense. What? For retain still, it fails not to dismiss with recompense. For to retain still and not be able to love is to heap up more injury. Thence this wise and pious law of dismission, now defended, took beginning. He, therefore, who lacking of his due in the most native and human end of marriage, thinks it better to part than to live sadly and injuriously to that cheerful covenant, for not to be beloved and yet retained is the greatest injury to a gentle spirit. He, I say, who therefore seeks to part, is one who highly honors the married life and would not stain it. Wow, that's so interesting, right? Just to think about this, Milton seems to be, he's making the argument for divorce. What's the basis through which he's making this argument for divorce? Would it be possible to say that in Milton defending divorce, he's defending marriage? Do you hear that question? How is Milton in defending divorce defending marriage? Milton really is raising the bar for what marriage entails. If you remember from, I don't even know if you remember, not from my class, if you had Professor Pearl in the ancient past, and he was talking about the inherited kind of ideology or perspective of Catholicism, there's a clear distinction between body and soul. And marriage is understood as a sanctified act that once done cannot be undone. Oh, I don't like her? Well, it doesn't make a difference. We're not really so concerned with what you like. You made this oath before God, or whatever, took this vow before God. And because of that, it can't be broken. You may not have the pleasures of the soul or even the body. That dichotomy will be relevant in another second. You may not have either one of those pleasures, but it makes no difference because really it's God who makes this marriage and no one therefore can break it. So Milton is introducing into divorce an idea of agency, introducing into marriage an idea of agency. If you're married and you're not able to love, well, that's doing, Milton says, more injury. Thence this wise and pious love dismissal, breaking up, now defended took being. He therefore, who lacking of his due in the most native and human end of marriage, thinks it better to part than to live sadly and injuriously to the cheerful convenant. He, I say, who therefore seeks to part, to divorce, is one who honors the married life and would not stain it. So Milton, again, it's gendered, and there are lots of other things we won't find appropriate to our age. But with all that said, we can see Milton's conception of agency in his understanding of divorce and also in his understanding of marriage. If we're now saying, if you are not happy, that takes precedence, meaning the human relationships, that determines the sanctity. Wow, it's pretty intense, right? The human relationship, there may be this divine vow or whatever, but it's the human relationship that gives sanctity to the institution, to this marriage. It's a kind of, it's not unlike, in some ways, it is indeed parallel to what we see in poems by John Donne. Let's think of the canonization, in which we see Donne in a very different mode and with a very different strategy, taking what's looked at as a base or vulgar sexual relationship and sanctifying it, meaning the poem, The Canonization, we are surprised to find out, is not about a saint being canonized, but it's about lovers. We are canonized for love. That is here done, or there, done is similarly giving a kind of sacred aspect to the relationship between the masculine and the feminine, and also the relationship between the relationship between agents, people. I mean, I think for Milton, the most important thing is, I mean, he talks about sex a lot, but also conversation. He needs to talk to somebody. So for him, again, the argument for divorce, and Milton is really the first person in England or in Europe, I think, to provide a doctrinal basis for divorce, meaning notwithstanding what we know about Henry VIII, Milton is really the first in the Western Christian tradition to argue seriously against the Catholic prohibition of divorce. And he's, interestingly, since he can't rely upon, or not always rely upon, the Christian tradition, he turns to the rabbinic tradition, which of course in the rabbinic tradition there is that idea of divorce. So this itself is a very, very interesting text, and we're unsurprised to find that even in all of his texts, we can find, in all of his works, we find underlying interests, themes, desires, drives, whatever you want to call them. I would say interests or tendencies. And we'll be very surprised to find one work which in some sense doesn't help make sense of another work. Let's look at Paradise Lost, Book 4, this part that we didn't look at last time. Look at maybe part of it. So they didn't, Adam and Eve, when they have sex here, there is no purity thing. They're not embarrassed, there are no disguises, no hypocrisy. And then here becomes this praise of marriage. And I think this praise of marriage really makes sense in relationship to Milton's defense of divorce. Our maker bids increase. Who bids abstain but our destroyer, foe to God and man? Who wants people to not procreate but Satan? Hail, wedded love, mysterious law, true source of human offspring, sole propriety and paradise of all things common else. By the adulterous lust was driven from man. So we see how Milton is positioning himself. Right in the middle of his pastoral is this very Christian conception of love. Hail, wedded love. By thee adulterous lust was driven from men among the bestial herds to range, by thee founded in reason, loyal, just, and pure. So here Milton is making a poetry out of virtue, relations dear, and all the charities of father, son, and brother first were known. Without the institution of marriage, without the putting off of, or the sublimating, forgive the term, the sublimating of desire, there is no such thing as father, son, and brother, because relationships are lost in adulterous lust. or far be it that I should write thee sin or blame. This is Milton, the poet talking. Or think the unbefitting holiest place. Now this is the place for you, perpetual fountain of domestic sweets, whose bed is undefiled and chaste pronounced. Remember how funny we thought it was that Milton describes chastity in Comus as, well, there he defines it as virginal, but in other places, and here is obviously one of them, chaste includes wedded love. You can be chaste and be married. I guess that's the difference between adulterous lust of the pagans and Christian wedded life. Is chastity or married love is still chaste, whose bed is undefiled and chaste pronounced, present or past, as saints and patriarchs used. Here, and not priests. Here love his golden shafts, paging Dr. Freud, employs. Here lights his constant lamp and waves his purple wings. Reigns here and revels not. Here Milton is distinguishing this kind of love from other kinds of love, but I think there's also a distinction between the kind of poem that he's writing and the kind of poems other people write, a distinction not only in the nature of the poem, but in the nature of the genre, not in the bought smile of harlots, loveless, joyless, unendeared casual fruition, nor in court amours, or mixed dance, or wanton mask, or midnight ball, or serenade, which the starved lover sings to his proud fair, best quitted with disdain. Wow. So there are all these other kinds of songs, and we know these songs from, I guess, different genres, some of them maybe even Shakespeare in some ways, but Milton calls them loveless, joyless, unendeared, and romance is reduced to casual fruition, nor in court amour, sounds like Romeo and Juliet, mixed dance, or wanton mask, also Romeo and Juliet, or midnight ball, or serenade, I don't know what that is, which the starved lovers sing, starved meaning desperate, I guess. Steering joke, courtly love, right? It's like it's an attack on courtly love. And being an attack on courtly love, it's an attack on the genres that deal with courtly love, right? Or wanton mask, or midnight ball, or serenade, which the starved lover sings to his proud fair, best quitted. What should she best do? Quit him with disdain. Romeo and Juliet, Juliet looking from the balcony should say, Romeo, go away. She should quit him with disdain. These lulled by nightingales, I always think of Romeo and Juliet when I think of larks and nightingales. These lulled by nightingales embracing slept, and on their naked limbs the floor roof showered roses which the morn repaired. Sleep on, blessed pair, and oh, yet happiest, if you seek no happier state, and know to know no more. So here Milton is redefining love, and in redefining love, he's redefining the poetry of love. Milton doesn't really write love poetry, or the love poet that he writes is the love poetry of Christian poetry. And he's distinguishing himself, maybe even from his own earlier career, wanton mask, Comus. And Milton is imagining a world of love which is distinct from the world of court amours, the songs themselves, but also the genres that write about court amours. And again, here Milton is distinguishing himself from the poetry and songs that others used to sing. And in a way, when Milton says, which the starved lover sings to his proud fair, best quitted with disdain, and obviously he's talking about a lover who's talking to who's proud, his beloved, who's best to ignore him or push him off. I think in some ways Milton is saying, you readers, you also, when you're confronted with that kind of poetry, you should put that off and also quit it with disdain. But just going back to Milton, relationships, divorce, Milton is like the first person who initiates a world where there are relationships, right? It's not just you marry this person because it serves a sacred function, but as we said before, just like in Donne, it's those in the relationship that make it sacred. So somehow, in this period, what we're seeing here is a sense here, I think, and this is an introduction to what we're doing this time as well, a way in which the physical and spiritual will come together. That's why I was talking about the dichotomies that we're familiar with Catholicism. Here they're kind of breaking down. meaning the body's okay. The body's okay insofar that it's informed by the spirit. You see it much more strongly in Donne's early love poems, where there's a mixture of the physical and the spiritual, the mixture of thought and feeling. That's T.S. Eliot, right? That's why he liked the 17th century. That's why he liked Donne. Didn't like Milton, but that's for another time. But also here in Milton, there is that sense of raising up the physical and making it, rendering it sacred. We're preparing for book 5, which we already mentioned, deals with Milton's metaphysics. And Milton's metaphysics dovetails with just these kind of issues. What is the relationship between spirit and body? What is the relationship between mind and matter? Right? The spirit and body one, that's more Catholic. The mind and matter one is more philosophical and Cartesian. So Milton's like a little bit of a, he's sandwiched. Milton, Donne, Shakespeare are sandwiched in between this Catholic worldview in which mind and body, spirit and body are separate, and this becoming extremely dominant philosophical world in which spirit and mind and matter are distinguished one from the other. Now, why again do we care about these things? Because we care about what is the relationship between soul and body. Is the body minor disturbance in the house. Body and soul then, for Donne and Milton here, they come together. They're not separate. Now, why is this important? And what would be the problem if you hold by a dualism altogether? So we'd say if you hold by a dualism, well, the physical is certainly looked at with less favor. Many philosophical and theological problems revolved around this. Let me just give you the contours of it in a very simple sense. So in a Catholic context, the Eucharist is a way of bringing the spiritual and the physical together, right? It's this privileged moment. God comes into the world and inspirits the body. That's in the realm of theological, even poetic language or poetic or theological experience. When 17th century philosophers come along, they do discover these things called spirit and matter, and it's disturbing to them because philosophers, most of them Christian, 17th century Christian philosophers, do desperately want to preserve the relationship between soul and body. That is, they want to think in some sense that man at least, maybe not animals, but man at least has some sense of that the spiritual or thought or the soul in some ways is in touch with the physical. Without that, you're left with a dichotomy, and that dichotomy is if you've read Thomas Hobbes, that's his worldview, meaning the world is all body, the world is all matter, there might be something above us, we have no idea, but the world is completely body. And how does that world, what does that world work on? Desire, power, all there is body and people, strong people, moving things around according to their desires. I mean, the strongest person in the Leviathan, the strongest person, as it were, you know this, is he's, as it were, he wins. So that's one extreme. The other extreme, and we mentioned this last time, is the Spinozan extreme, where mind and body are identical. And when mind and body are identical, well, that's really in that worldview is the beginning of Romanticism. It's the beginning of it's the beginning of Oprah Winfrey. I don't know if you saw this very bad TV movie with Shirley MacLaine. You surely didn't, but I can send you the link. And she goes out to her East Hampton home, and she's on the beach, and she runs into the ocean screaming out, "I am God." And there is a line between Spinoza and that scene in that very bad Shirley MacLaine movie. Meaning there's that sense where the physical itself, if it becomes holy, well, then you push the divine out altogether. A philosopher like Descartes, well, he was convinced that there's a separation between spirit and matter, but he still nonetheless wanted to preserve the connection. It was very hard to mediate between the two different perspectives, that perspective of Descartes, the identity, and that perspective of Hobbes. Milton's complicated. He doesn't really solve the problem for anybody except for him, I think. The one who really solves the problem for scientists, and maybe we'll do this at some point, is Isaac Newton. He's actually the one who comes up with a metaphor that is suitable for both philosophers and theologians. Fascinating episode in intellectual history, how that happens, how it's Newton, the great Newton. And Newton, you can't imagine, like we worship Einstein in our culture, the same thing times 10 with Newton. He was called the divine Newton, and mostly for his optics and the other stuff, the math, the calculus and all that stuff. But he also was very much immersed in surprise, Jewish Kabbalah, in mysticism. He was fascinated by the physics of the temple in Jerusalem. So he spent 20 years trying to perfect the methods of alchemy. So Newton is distinctive in being part in the beginning of a scientific tradition, but also the end of a poetic tradition. I think that's really a useful term, the end of a poetic tradition that goes through Milton. But here, so again, I'm just giving you the outline. There is this philosophical bind. It really becomes a philosophical bind, meaning philosophers, they insist on binary dichotomous languages. And once you do that, you either become Spinoza or Hobbes, or you do very weird stuff like Descartes said. And Descartes said that there is a way in which the mind and body come together, or soul and body come together. That's through the pineal gland. Here it is, this Descartes and the pineal gland. The pineal gland is a tiny organ in the center of the brain that played an important role in Descartes' philosophy. It's like he had to locate the soul someplace. He's got to put it someplace in the body, so he puts it here. To me, it's like a philosophical band-aid, and he's just trying to not be Hobbes. He does not want to be Hobbes. There's no chance that he'll be Spinoza because he's a dualist, but there is a chance that he would be Hobbes. Okay, and Milton is, we'll see, is negotiating that as well. He is not, why are poets better than philosophers? Well, here, because philosophers are limited to the extent that they use categorical languages that are exclusive, meaning that they don't believe it. You can't have both in philosophy. You can have, however, more than one perspective in literature, which we see, that's Milton's method, basically, in Paradise Lost. This multiplication of lenses or metaphors. And you can also have paradox. I mean, the two things are probably related. Anyway, so that's kind of our introduction to book 5 and this whole idea of angels eating. That's our frame for it. I hope we'll have the opportunity to come back to aspects of this frame. See ya.